Before we dive into these captivating stories, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to never miss our latest thrilling tales. It was supposed to be an ordinary shift in the bustling ER. The air buzzed with urgency as patients came in one after another, their pain and panic palpable. I was a young medical student, still learning to balance my nerves with the demands of the job. That day, amidst the chaos, a case landed on my chart. Mr. Javier, a man in his late 30s complaining of severe testicular pain. His symptoms seemed straightforward at first glance, nothing unusual. Yet, from the moment I pulled back the curtain to introduce myself, an unexplainable unease gripped me. His smile was overly friendly, his demeanor oddly calm despite his reported pain. I brushed it off as my own inexperience, determined to approach the case with professionalism. Little did I know, this was the beginning of an encounter that would haunt me for years to come. Mr. Javier's tone was casual, his descriptions oddly precise. "It's been hurting for hours," he said, wincing theatrically. As I asked standard, diagnostic questions, his responses were laced with strange comments. "You're very attentive," he remarked, his eyes lingering longer than was comfortable. At first I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to nerves on his part. But as the examination progressed, his behavior grew more unsettling. He seemed almost too engaged, making subtle yet inappropriate remarks that were difficult to address outright. My unease deepened when I noticed how his symptoms appeared to fade whenever he spoke, only to reappear when I resumed medical inquiries. Something wasn't adding up. I felt a knot of apprehension in my stomach, unsure how to proceed without overstepping boundaries. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. When I stepped out to consult Dr. Patel, my supervising physician, I mentioned my discomfort. He listened intently, his expression growing grim. "Let's finish the exam together," he said, his voice calm but firm. As we approached Mr. Javier's bed, the atmosphere felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. Dr. Patel took over, his questions precise and probing. Mr. Javier's demeanor shifted. His earlier confidence gave way to defensiveness. It became clear that this wasn't his first visit to the ER. Dr. Patel's questions revealed inconsistencies in Mr. Javier's account, and his evasive responses only heightened our suspicions. I watched as Dr. Patel maintained a professional yet assertive tone, gradually exposing the cracks in Mr. Javier's story. The realization hit me like a cold wave. This man wasn't here for medical help. My unease transformed into a chilling certainty. We were dealing with something far more sinister. After Mr. Javier was discharged, Dr. Patel pulled me aside. His expression was grave. "This isn't the first time he's been here," he began, his voice low. "Mr. Javier has a history of presenting these symptoms, always targeting new medical students." My stomach churned as he elaborated. Over the past few months, Mr. Javier had visited multiple times, each encounter following the same unsettling pattern. He would fabricate symptoms to lure inexperienced students into uncomfortable situations, exploiting their inexperience and eagerness to help. "It's predatory behavior," Dr. Patel said bluntly. I felt a mix of anger, disgust, and disbelief. The ER, a place where people sought healing and hope, had been used as a stage for manipulation. The weight of what I had witnessed sank in. I realized how naive I had been, and a sense of betrayal lingered as I tried to process the truth. Dr. Patel decided to confront Mr. Javier before he left. Together we approached his bed one last time. Dr. Patel's tone was measured but firm. "Mr. Javier, we've reviewed your history," he began. "There's a concerning pattern here." Mr. Javier's demeanor changed instantly. The charm and friendliness vanished, replaced by cold hostility. "I'm just here seeking help," he said, his voice defensive. Dr. Patel didn't waver, calmly outlining the repeated incidents and warning him that further behavior of this nature would result in formal action. Mr. Javier didn't respond. Instead, he gathered his belongings and left without another word. The encounter left me shaken. I'd never seen someone's facade crumble so quickly, nor had I witnessed such deliberate manipulation. As the tension in the room dissipated, I felt a mix of relief and lingering dread. The reality of what had transpired began to sink in. Once Mr. Javier was gone, Dr. Patel and I sat down for a debrief. He spoke with a calm authority, emphasizing the importance of vigilance in medicine. "We're here to help people," he said, "but we can't ignore our instincts. Not everyone has good intentions." His words resonated deeply. The encounter had revealed a side of medicine I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about diagnosing illnesses. It was about navigating the complexities of human behavior, including the darker aspects. That night, I replayed the events in my mind, questioning if I had missed any signs or if I could have handled it differently. The experience left me feeling vulnerable, but also more determined to protect myself and my future patients. It was a harsh but necessary lesson in the reality of working in medicine. Over the following weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of Mr. Javier. His behavior was a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities inherent in medical practice. As a student, I had been eager to learn, to help, to trust. But that trust had been exploited. I began to see how crucial it was to maintain boundaries and to trust my instincts, even when it felt uncomfortable. Dr. Patel's guidance became a cornerstone of my approach to medicine. I started to understand that skepticism wasn't cynicism. It was a form of self-preservation. The experience didn't just teach me about patient care, it taught me about myself and the kind of doctor I wanted to become. Though painful, it was a lesson I knew I would carry with me throughout my career. As years passed, the memory of Mr. Javier remained vivid. His case became a cautionary tale I shared with new medical students during their training. Medicine is about compassion, I would tell them, but it's also about protecting yourself and your patients. The balance between empathy and vigilance became a defining principle in my practice. I learned to trust my gut, to recognize red flags, and to act decisively when something felt wrong. The experience with Mr. Javier shaped not only my professional approach but also my understanding of human nature. It was a painful lesson, but one that made me a better doctor and a stronger person. Even now I remind myself to remain cautious, knowing that the trust placed in me as a physician is both a privilege and a responsibility. Even now, years later, the memory of Mr. Javier lingers in the back of my mind. It serves as a constant reminder of the complexities of the profession I chose. I often think about how easily trust can be manipulated, how a place meant for healing can be exploited. Each time I walk into an exam room, I carry that memory with me. It sharpens my focus, reminding me to stay vigilant and to trust my instincts. The experience taught me that medicine is not just about diagnosing illnesses, but also about understanding people, their motives, their vulnerabilities, and their potential for deceit. It's a lesson I wish I hadn't learned in such a personal way, but one I'm grateful for nonetheless. The scars it left are invisible, but they're a part of who I am now, shaping my approach to every patient I meet. The encounter with Mr. Javier was one of the most unsettling experiences of my medical career. It left me with an unshakable sense of caution, a heightened awareness of the darker side of human nature. But it also strengthened my resolve to be the best doctor I could be. The lessons I learned that day continue to guide me, reminding me of the delicate balance between compassion and vigilance. I've shared the story with colleagues and students, hoping to prepare them for the unexpected challenges they might face. Medicine is a field of immense trust, but it's also one of immense responsibility. The memory of Mr. Javier is a stark reminder of that duality. As unsettling as it was, it made me a better physician, and for that, I am grateful. But even now, I sometimes find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if I'll ever encounter another patient like him. It began with a sound I'll never forget, a chair screeching across the floor, the kind of sound that makes your skin crawl, especially when you know no one else is around. I was sitting alone at the nursing station, eyes glued to a patient chart, when it happened. At first I froze, thinking maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Long night shifts can do that. But when I turned my head, the chair was unmistakably out of place, moved a good 3 feet from where it had been moments before. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was an uneven floor, I told myself. Maybe someone bumped it earlier and I hadn't noticed. logical explanations. Those were my lifeline. But as the silence closed in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the room itself was holding its breath. I glanced down the hallway, hoping to see a colleague, anyone, but the corridor was empty. Just a dim row of lights flickering faintly, casting long, warped shadows. That seemed to stretch toward me. That's when I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping, like knuckles gently rapping against wood. It was coming from the far end of the hall, near one of the patient rooms. I stood up, my legs trembling as if they might give out. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound confident, but my voice cracked. The tapping stopped instantly. Silence that followed was worse, oppressive, like it was daring me to move. I took a step forward, then another, my shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Every step felt wrong, like I was walking into something I couldn't see. Something that was waiting for me. When I reached the room, my breath caught in my throat. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if someone had just slipped through. I nudged it open, peering inside, expecting, what? A patient? A prank? Instead, I found nothing. The bed was neatly made, untouched. The call button on the bedside table sat quietly, unlit. But the cold in that room, it was like stepping into a freezer. I knew then that I wasn't imagining things. Something was there with me, unseen but undeniably present. And it wasn't just watching, it wanted me to know it was there. Working. Night shifts at the nursing station always came with its challenges. Fatigue, endless paperwork, and the occasional emergency call. But this was something no training could prepare me for. Normally, the station was a safe space, a quiet hub where we'd monitor patients and catch up on charts while the world outside slept. The other nurses often joked about the midnight visitor, some ghostly figure said to roam the halls. I'd laughed it off every time. It's just old pipes and tired minds, I'd say, brushing off their stories. But as I stood there in that freezing room staring at the untouched bed, their words echoed in my mind. I tried to think logically. Maybe I'd imagined the chair moving. Maybe the tapping was just the building settling. Hospitals are old, I told myself. They creak, groan, and make all kinds of noises. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't fit. Not this time. There were other stories too, ones I'd overheard but never paid much attention to. Like the nurse who swore she heard footsteps trailing her in an empty hallway. Or the tech who quit after seeing shadows dart across the walls when no one was around. I'd always thought they were exaggerating or just tired. Now I wasn't so sure. Standing there, I felt exposed, like the walls had eyes. The air seemed heavier, as if it carried the weight of something unseen, something that didn't belong. My pulse raced, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Curiosity? Fear? I'm not sure what kept me rooted in place. All I knew was that this wasn't just another long night shift. It felt personal, as if the station itself was alive and it had chosen me to be its witness. The strange events didn't stop there. In fact, they grew bolder. It started small. Items I'd placed neatly on the desk would shift when I turned away. Pens disappeared, only to reappear hours later in the most unlikely places. The clipboard I'd just set down would be on the floor, as if someone or something had swept it off. I tried to ignore it, blaming my exhaustion, but then something happened that I couldn't dismiss. I was walking back from checking on a patient when the call bell rang from an empty room. My heart sank. I knew no one was in there. That room had been unoccupied for weeks, undergoing maintenance. I hesitated outside the door, every nerve in, my body screaming at me not to go in. But I had to. Slowly, I pushed it open. The room was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of the bed, still covered in its protective plastic, untouched. The air was cold again, biting at my skin, and it carried that same suffocating heaviness. I stepped closer to the call button, and that's when I saw it. The bed was indented, as if someone was sitting on it. I stared, frozen, watching as the indentation deepened, like weight was being added. I backed away, my hands trembling, and whispered, "This can't be real." But the moment I spoke, The call button's light flickered and went out. The room plunged into total darkness. Now I was terrified. Every shadow felt alive. Every sound amplified my fear. I tried to focus on my work, but the station didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a trap. That's when the whispers started. At first, they were faint, just a soft hum in the back of my mind, so subtle I thought I was imagining it. But they grew louder, clearer, and unmistakably real. They weren't words exactly, more like fragmented sounds, layered over each other. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then, one night, as I sat alone at the desk, I heard my name. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was barely more than a breath, but it sent a chill down my spine. I whipped around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the station was empty. The walls seemed to close in around me as the whisper came again, this time closer, more insistent. The chair beside me slid back on its own, the screeching sound cutting through the air. I bolted upright, knocking over a stack of papers, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The worst came on my final shift before I took a leave of absence. I'd decided to stay close to the break room, where the lights were brighter and the air felt less oppressive. But even there, I wasn't safe. It started with a shadow. I was sitting with my back to the wall when I saw it, a dark, formless shape moving across the far side of the room. My breath hitched as I followed its path. It wasn't like a person's shadow. It had no defined edges, no discernible figure. It was just darkness, shifting unnaturally against the light. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. My legs felt glued to the chair as the shadow crept closer. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness. And in that split second, I felt it. Cold fingers brushing against my shoulder. I screamed and bolted for the hallway. The sound of my own footsteps echoed back at me, overlapping, as if someone, or something, was running right behind me. Didn't stop running until I reached the exit, bursting through the doors and into the cool night air. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my car. When I finally sat behind the wheel, I let out a sob I hadn't realized I was holding back. I didn't go back to the nursing station after that night. I told my supervisor I needed time off, citing personal reasons. I didn't dare tell them the truth. Who would believe me? Since then, I've heard more stories from the staff about things they've seen and felt. They all laugh nervously, saying the place is haunted, but I know better. It's not just haunted, it's alive. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the cold grip of those unseen forces. Sometimes I wonder what they want, or if they're trying to send a message. But most of the time, I just pray they've forgotten me. I'll never know what I encountered that night, but one thing is certain. I'm not the same person I was before. And if you ever find yourself alone in a place like that, remember, some things aren't meant to be seen. It was the early hours of a quiet morning in 1989. The dim light of the hospital room cast eerie shadows on the pale walls, amplifying the stillness around me. I had just given birth the day before, my body weak, my mind foggy but alert enough to notice every creak of the floor and whisper of the wind. My son, so tiny and fragile, lay peacefully in his bassinet beside me, his soft breaths the only sound anchoring me to reality. But then, a strange sensation crept over me, as if unseen eyes were watching. I dismissed it as exhaustion, but the feeling refused to leave. It was as though something was off, a foreboding I couldn't shake. Little did I know, the events that would follow would haunt me forever. The door to my room creaked open, and I instinctively turned to look. A nurse entered, her expression unreadable, her uniform crisp and devoid of identification. She wasn't one of the nurses I had seen during my stay, and something about her presence sent a shiver down my spine. She moved with purpose, her gaze fixed on the bassinet. Before I could process what was happening, she gripped one end of the bassinet and began pulling it away. My maternal instincts kicked in, and I grabbed the other end, refusing to let go. My voice trembled as I demanded, "What are you doing?" Her reply was quick but unsettling. "I'm taking him for his blood tests." Her words didn't sit right with me. I was a nurse myself, and I knew the routine procedures for newborns. My son had already had his blood tests. The small band-aid on his heel was proof. "He's already had his tests," I said, my grip tightening on the bassinet. "What kind of test are you talking about?" Her response was vague, a muttered excuse about not being sure. My suspicion deepened, and a cold fear began to crawl up my spine. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The nurse's demeanor shifted as she realized I wasn't letting go. Her movements became hesitant, almost nervous. I refused to relent. "Find out what test it is and let me know," I said firmly, my voice laced with both fear and defiance. She paused, her gaze flickering from me to the bassinet, and then she retreated, leaving the room without another word. As the door closed behind her, my heart pounded in my chest. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I stared at my sleeping son, the shadows in the room suddenly darker, more menacing. Minutes turned into hours, but the nurse never returned. The silence in the room was deafening, each passing moment amplifying my unease. My mind raced with questions. Who was she? What did she want with my son? And why hadn't she come back? The hospital, once a place of safety, now felt like a maze of hidden dangers. I clung to my son, my grip on reality slipping as the lines between exhaustion and paranoia blurred. Looking back, it was my instincts that saved us. Something deep within me screamed that the situation wasn't normal. My training as a nurse told me one thing, but my heart told me another. And that heart, driven by an overwhelming need to protect, refused to let go of that bassinet. I began piecing together fragments of information, recalling whispers I'd heard during my pregnancy, stories of imposters, dressed in uniforms taking babies from unsuspecting mothers. The thought sent chills through me, each one colder than the last. The summer of 1989 had seen a string of disappearances in our area. Newborns taken from hospitals by people posing as staff. Authorities had warned hospitals to tighten security, but it seemed the warnings weren't enough. Could the woman in my room have been one of them? The possibility was too horrifying to fully comprehend. I felt a mix of relief and terror. Relief that my son was still with me. Terror at how close we had come to losing him. The days that followed were a blur, but the questions lingered. Why hadn't I reported the incident? What if she had tried again with another mother, another baby? Guilt gnawed at me, and I found myself replaying the events over and over in my mind. Each time I'd arrive at the same chilling conclusion. We had narrowly escaped a nightmare, and yet there was no way to know for sure. I never spoke of the incident to anyone. Not the doctors, not my family, not even my husband. It felt too surreal, too terrifying to put into words. What if they didn't believe me? What if I was dismissed as a paranoid new mother? But the memory stayed with me, vivid and unrelenting, a constant reminder of the fragility of safety and the strength of a mother's intuition. Now, decades later, I still wonder. Was she just a confused nurse, or was she something far more sinister? The answer is lost to time, but the lesson remains. Trust your instincts. They may be the only thing standing between you and the unthinkable. And as I look at my son today, grown and thriving, I can't help but feel gratitude for that morning in 1989. A moment of terror that could have ended in tragedy, but instead became a testament to a mother's love and determination. The day started like any other. My grandfather had been in and out of the hospital for weeks now. His condition was fragile but stable, or so we thought. I walked into the dimly lit hospital room that day, greeted by the faint hum of machines and the sterile smell of antiseptic. Grandpa lay on the bed, his frail frame barely making a dent in the thin mattress. He smiled weakly as I entered, but something felt off. The usual nurses were gone, replaced by a man I'd never seen before. He stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes cold and calculating, his name tag crooked as if hastily pinned. New staff? I asked, trying to sound casual. The man nodded but said nothing. His silence sent a chill down my spine, and for the first time I felt a nagging sense of unease. Something wasn't right, but I brushed it off. I had no idea that this stranger's presence would mark the beginning of a nightmare. It wasn't, long before the oddities began. That evening, while the rest of my family sat in the hospital cafeteria, I stayed back to keep Grandpa company. The man returned, this time holding a syringe. "What's that for?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He hesitated, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he muttered something about routine medication. But I noticed his hand trembling as he held the syringe, and his eyes darted toward the door, as if he were waiting for someone to interrupt. "I'll call the nurse," I said, standing up. He froze, his expression turning to stone. "No need," he said quickly. Too quickly. My gut screamed at me to stop him, but I didn't have proof. Instead, I watched as he injected the fluid into Grandpa's IV, my heart pounding louder than the beep of the heart monitor. Within hours, Grandpa's condition worsened. His breathing became labored, his skin pale and clammy. The cheerful nurse from earlier returned and frowned at the charts. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured, flipping through pages. I told her about the man, about the injection, but she dismissed it as paranoia. "The new guy is just adjusting," she said with a forced smile. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something sinister. I stayed by Grandpa's side all night, my eyes darting to every shadow in the room. The man never came back that night, but I could feel his presence lingering like a dark cloud. Unable to ignore my suspicions, I started digging. The next day, I went to the hospital's administration office, pretending to be a concerned family member wanting to know about staffing changes. It took some prying, but I learned the man's name, Robert Keene. A quick online search revealed a troubling past. Accusations of negligence, unexplained patient deaths, and a trail of transfers from hospital to hospital. My hands shook as I scrolled through the articles, each detail confirming my worst fears. This wasn't just a disgruntled worker. This was someone dangerous. Armed with this information, I approached the hospital staff. They were defensive, dismissive even. "We've reviewed his file," they insisted. "There's nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about? Grandpa's health was deteriorating by the minute, and no one seemed to care. Desperate, I decided to confront Robert directly. Catching him in the hallway, I demanded to know what he'd injected into my grandfather. "Medication," he said flatly. "What kind?" I pressed. He smirked, the kind of smirk that made my blood run cold. "Don't worry," he said, walking away. "He'll be fine. Or not." That night, I stayed in Grandpa's room, determined not to let Robert near him. The hours dragged, on each creak of the floor or flicker of the fluorescent light making my heart race. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside the door. Quiet, deliberate. I peeked through the crack and saw him standing there holding another syringe. My breath caught as I watched him reach for the door handle. Summoning every ounce of courage, I threw the door open and shouted for help. Startled, he dropped the syringe and bolted down the hallway. Security arrived moments later, but Robert was gone. The syringe lay on the floor, its contents a mystery. The hospital staff tried to downplay the incident, calling it a misunderstanding. They even suggested I'd imagined it in my sleep-deprived state. "We'll handle it internally," they promised, but I wasn't buying it. They were protecting him, and I was running out of time to protect my grandfather, determined to expose the truth. I sent the syringe to a private lab for testing. The results confirmed my fears. It contained a lethal dose of a drug used in euthanasia. My hands trembled as I read the report. How many others had fallen victim to this man? How close? Had Grandpa come to being another statistic? The hospital, now aware of the test results, tried to silence me. They threatened legal action, citing patient confidentiality. But I wasn't backing down. I contacted the police, armed with evidence and a burning determination. Robert disappeared before they could arrest him. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air, leaving behind only fear and unanswered questions. The hospital issued a bland statement about reviewing their hiring practices, but it was too little, too late. Grandpa survived, but he's never been the same. The ordeal left him weaker, quieter, as if the shadow of death still lingered over him. As for me, I can't step into a hospital without feeling a cold wave of dread. I never thought I'd end up in a situation like this. But there I was, sitting alone in the dimly lit hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. The air was heavy with the faint smell of antiseptic and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like a warning siren, but the corners of the room seemed unnaturally dark. My heart raced, pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. Why hadn't the nurse returned? It had been over an hour since she left to get my test results. Then, I noticed him. A man was sitting in the far corner of the room, shrouded in darkness. At first, I thought he was just another patient, maybe waiting for news like me. But the longer I stared, the more unsettling his presence became. He wasn't moving, not even shifting in his seat. It was as if he were carved from stone. His face was barely visible, but the faint gleam of his eyes caught the light just enough to make me shiver. Something about him felt wrong, deeply wrong. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he was asleep, or maybe my exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, his head was tilted slightly to the side, and I swear he was staring directly at me. My skin prickled, and a wave of unease washed over me. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice cracking. No response. I stood up and took a hesitant step forward, but something stopped me. His mouth curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was something predatory. My instinct screamed at me to sit back down, to look away. But I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in his gaze. Suddenly, the lights flickered. In the brief moment of darkness, I heard the faintest whisper, though I couldn't make out the words. When the light stabilized, he was still there. But now he was sitting on the edge of his seat, leaning slightly forward. I nearly jumped out of my skin when the nurse finally returned. Her sudden appearance broke the spell, and I turned to her with desperate eyes. "There's a man in the corner," I said, pointing toward him. She looked confused. "What man?" I whipped my head back around, but the corner was empty. The chair where he'd been sitting was now eerily vacant, as if no one had ever been there. I blinked, my mind racing to rationalize what I'd seen. "He was just there," I insisted, my voice rising. The nurse placed a calming hand on my arm. "You've been under a lot of stress. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us. Let me get you some water." As she left again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner. He was gone, but the oppressive sense of dread remained. I decided to leave. Whatever test results I was waiting for didn't seem worth staying in this creepy hospital any longer. I pressed the button for the elevator and waited, my eyes nervously, flicking back to the waiting room. When the elevator doors finally slid open, I stepped inside, relieved to be alone. But as the doors began to close, I saw him again. He was standing at the far end of the hallway just beyond the waiting room. His silhouette was unmistakable, and his eyes, they glowed faintly in the dim light. "Hold the door," I shouted, panicking. But it was too late. The elevator doors shut with a cold metallic thud, and I was trapped inside. As the elevator began its descent, the lights flickered again. The air grew colder, and a low, guttural sound filled the small space. It was laughter, soft, chilling laughter that seemed to echo from all directions. The elevator jerked to a stop on the basement level, even though I hadn't pressed the button. The doors opened to reveal a long, dark corridor lined with flickering fluorescent lights. My pulse raced as I stared into the abyss, my feet rooted to the elevator floor. And then, I saw him again. He was standing at the far end of the hallway, motionless, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. This time, there was no mistaking it. He was waiting for me. The laughter echoed again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't just coming from him. It was all around me, filling the space like a sinister symphony. I slammed my hand against the elevator buttons, desperate to make the doors close. But they didn't budge. The man took a slow, deliberate step forward, his movements unnaturally jerky, like a puppet on strings. "Stay away!" I screamed, my voice trembling with terror. He didn't stop. Another step, and another. His smile widened, revealing unnaturally sharp teeth. My knees buckled, and I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the far wall of the elevator. Just as he was about to reach the door, the elevator doors finally closed and it began to rise. But I knew this wasn't over. When the elevator doors opened again, I bolted out, not caring where I was. My only thought was to get away from him. The hallways were a maze of identical doors and harsh lighting, but I didn't stop running. My footsteps echoed loudly, but they weren't alone. Behind me, I could hear the distinct sound of heavy, uneven footsteps. "You can't run," a voice whispered, so close it felt like it was right next to my ear. I whipped my head around, but no one was there. I burst into an operating room and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. The room was empty, but the surgical tools on the table gleamed ominously under the sterile lights. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. Then, the lights went out. In the pitch black, I could hear it again. The laughter. This time, it was accompanied by the sound of nails scraping against the door. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, his form barely visible in the darkness. His eyes glowed, and his smile was wider than ever. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice a raspy whisper that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed a scalpel from the table, my hands shaking violently. "Stay back!" I screamed, but he just laughed. The next thing I remember, I was waking up in a hospital bed. The nurse was there, smiling warmly as she adjusted my IV. "You fainted in the waiting room," she said. "You've been out for hours." But when I glanced at the corner of the room, my heart stopped. He was there, sitting in the shadows, his glowing eyes fixed on me. And this time, he didn't disappear.